Happy New Year and welcome to 2026 on this channel. Connor Klein, geopolitics from Ukraine. I rang in the new year here with some friends in spite of Russia's best attempts to ruin the festive season on us. We had a lot of air alerts and attacks over the holiday period so far. However, the electricity is holding up at least this evening as I film this. So going into 2026, it looks like being a key year, but I guess every year is key in a war of existential survival from Ukraine's point of view. However, as I've been saying on my lifestyle channel for about 2 years and here on this geopolitics channel, end of 2025, second half, Russia was going to face three major issues: manpower, money, and materiel. Now those three issues are coming to a head. Russia, of course, can try and find solutions to all these problems. They have been trying to find solutions to these problems. However, now they are under real pressure. They are spending 40% of their budget for 2025 and 2026. Their official budget, 40% goes on this war plus internal security. They have high inflation. They are in recession. They have high interest rates. Now they have an issue with the war economy crowding out the civilian economy. And that's not very productive to build something, put a price or a value on it, and then it gets blown up in Ukraine in the coming weeks, not helping the long-term viability of the Russian state economically. So now we see oil prices are quite low. I think they're like $40 a barrel. I think their budget is calculating about $60 per barrel plus because of the sanctions. Russia needs to sell its resources at a discount to get people to take the risk on buying them. So all in all, things are looking pretty bleak for Moscow economically. Now, they can cut back on everything else that Russians have their money spent on, their state money spent on, and they can try and, I guess, borrow, but they cannot borrow at cheap interest rates, and it's not clear how much pain the Russian public are willing to take. There's always been an assumption that they'll basically put up with anything as long as they are prosecuting this imperial war to regain control of Ukraine. However, that is untested, and many Russians are in favor of winning the war and don't care very much for the large numbers of Ukrainians who are killed or the destruction here, but they presumably aren't as keen on that if it makes them poorer, and in particular when they see no light at the end of the tunnel in terms of Moscow achieving its stated strategic goals here, which are basically to take over Ukraine at the very minimal politically, if not directly annex it. It is definitely not to be fighting in Donbass. How many years have we got? 12 years after they started the war in 2014, and 4 years since they started this more extended invasion with the explicit goal of taking control of Ukraine, and they are further away than they were in mid-2022. They now control still less than 20% of Ukraine's territory, including what they'd seized before the 2022 invasion. So not a whole lot to show for just wrecked parts of the Donbass in general, or a completely looted city of Mariupol that was sacked at the beginning of the invasion in 2022. So not looking good from an economic point of view, and also the amount of pain the Russians will be asked to go through, in particular when you see how little progress they're making. They're making, I think it was 0.7% of Ukrainian territory they took last year at the cost of hundreds of thousands. They're stuck outside Pokrovsk, Minarhad agglomeration for, must be going on almost 18 months. They lost the city once again of Kupiansk that they had retaken. They lost that in the Ukrainian offensive of 2022, and they had taken it back. However, they've lost it again, and there seems to be a failure to even officially recognize the fact that Ukrainians have taken it back. All in all, that is a huge issue for Russia. Wars are expensive, and this one in particular is not looking good for Russia. They're basically blowing through the war chest. There's 300 billion euros of their assets also frozen in Western financial institutions. They haven't been seized yet, but there's also a risk that that will happen as well. Now, the other two issues are manpower. They're going to connect again, and materiel. So manpower, after the unpopular partial mobilization of 300,000 soldiers by Vladimir Putin in the autumn of 2022, they changed their strategy and started to pay enormous sign-up bonuses and wages to soldiers who sign up for the duration of the special military operation. And many Russians, especially when Donald Trump came back to power in DC, they thought, well, he's going to force the war to end. He's going to force the Ukrainians to capitulate, and they could safely, well, not entirely safely, but safer, from a safer point of view, sign up for the military, calculating they would get the sign-up bonus and not actually have to fight for very long in Ukraine because they thought the war would come to a close. However, I think those hopes are dashed. It's very clear that Vladimir Putin has no intention of ending this war at this point without a short-term full capitulation by Ukraine. What Donald Trump has been trying to push Ukraine towards is basically a medium to long-term capitulation and their return to the Russian sphere of influence. And that is not enough for Vladimir Putin. He doesn't want to take the risk of losing power. It's one of the leitmotifs that I emphasize here. Vladimir Putin wakes up every day and his priority number one is staying in power for the following day. It is not necessarily winning this war. And he definitely doesn't want to stop it at the moment because he not have achieved his strategic aims at a huge cost. And he may have to deal with all those soldiers coming back, being demobilized and demotivated from partaking in normal life, considering the economy is going in a mess. They're used to getting paid an absolute fortune in the military, and a lot of them are going to be sadistic and psychotic, and he will have a mark on his back in terms of staying on in power, especially in such a debacle. So for him, at the moment, in the short term, it is better to keep prosecuting this war, even if Donald Trump is basically trying to force Ukraine into some sort of medium to long-term capitulation. That is not enough for Vladimir Putin. It seems in his calculations, he thinks he's going to win anyways eventually. He just thinks that the collective West is so weak that he'll be able to push through and show more resolve, and that Russian people will be willing to live through economically harsh times in order to help him achieve that goal. So that is the manpower. This is the first time in many years, the last 3 years at least, since they went for this new tactic, that the Russian army is losing more soldiers in Ukraine every month than they recruit. That means that with the economy being so bad, not having extra money to pay the soldiers, that Russia may have to gamble and go for another mobilization. That in the short term, of course, would bring in a lot of soldiers to the Russian military. They may be able to increase then the rate that they are taking territory, which is very, very costly per square kilometer. It's absolutely insane how many soldiers they are losing. It is higher than the Red Army was losing per square kilometer. Like the Soviets had come from way further, obviously going dramatically further west than the Russian armies, which is going at a snail's pace, even slower than a snail. So they could get that in the short term. However, considering that 1 million Russian men left back in the autumn of 2022 when Vladimir Putin did this the other time, it will probably make him very unpopular. It may mean a lot more able-bodied men leave the country. And Russia has been, it seems, starting to bring in workers from other countries to replace Russian men who are either at the front or have left the country. However, that would accelerate, and that again would undermine Vladimir Putin's popularity. And then the third thing is materiel. This is now becoming predominantly a drone war, and that means that Russia is probably less reliant than it was in the previous years on its Soviet-era stocks, which they've basically completely burned through. They've burnt over 50% of them, and the stuff that's left is presumably the stuff that was in the worst state. So it's not really clear how much of that they have left. They do need to keep a strategic reserve of material, manpower for dealing with maybe some border crisis somewhere else, or another contingency like maybe a conflict within Russia. For example, if Ramzan Kadyrov were to pass away in Chechnya, the North Caucasus could be ignited, that tinderbox that is just sitting there in terms of conflict. There could be a war of succession there, and then Russia would presumably need some resources to allocate to that. One thing we might see as a gamble by Vladimir Putin, if by, say, the middle of 2026, he is not making any headway and there is no light at the end of the tunnel with respect to what he can achieve in Ukraine, he may go for a Hail Mary to achieve a strategic victory, and that would actually be to test Article 5 of NATO by increasing to some sort of limited incursion of some NATO territory. It could be in Estonia, it could be in Lithuania, where you got the Slovakia gap, could be in Estonia, you got Narva, or it could be in Finland or somewhere like that. There are just some examples, and by proving that, number one, the US is not going to send any troops to eject whatever Russian forces have seized some territory, it may also show that European countries don't have the solidarity to deal with such a contingency. You could expect to see Belarus used as to apply pressure. They've already stationed Oreshnik and other weapons there that then they could threaten other European countries with retaliation with, should they intervene to, say, help Latvia or Estonia, whatever country is attacked. So that could be something that's very high risk from Vladimir Putin's point of view, because if he is made to stand down or those troops are ejected, it will definitely undermine his legitimacy in Russia that he gambled yet again and lost. However, he may feel that it is the moment to try it, because by waiting longer, then he gives those countries obviously more time to prepare for their defenses. And just final comment on the materiel. The war has changed quite a bit since 2023. You don't have trenches that are manned by massive amount of troops anymore, where they fight in the trenches as much as becomes so drone dominated. And actually, a lot of times it's now drones fighting drones. We'd expect this to continue in 2026. And it is not clear at the moment who will have the upper hand in terms of drone production. Ukrainians typically have been a bit more innovative. However, they lack the capacity or the production base to take those innovations and ramp them up in terms of massive production, because even though they have more drones than the Russian side, it is not clear who will be able to win the drone war to a certain extent. Probably Ukraine looks still to have a bit of an advantage since they moved a little bit earlier to that. However, it is changing the way that the war is being fought. We've seen a huge increase in the number of Russian casualties in the last 5 or 6 months or so, as they use small groups of infantry. They do not use armored fighting vehicles and other armored vehicles as much as they have been previously. Also, they're running out of their stocks of those to a certain extent, but they are using these infiltration groups that are very, very costly in terms of human life. So expect all that to continue to evolve. Just to refer back to the possibility of Putin trying to test Article 5, whilst Russia is stuck in Pokrovsk, they are stuck in Donbass. The estimate is to take them at least 2 to 3 years at the current pace to even take Donbass, because you had Tulsi Gabbard recently claim that, well, if they can't defeat the Ukrainians, how could they attack a NATO country? One has to remember that the two best armies in Europe at the moment are the Russian and Ukrainian armies. The rest of Europe is not even clear what would happen if the US had to respond to contingencies now, because drone warfare, for example, they're not the leading lights in terms of tactics, strategic nous, or the production of the massive numbers of drones that are going to be involved. The Ukrainian and Russian troops are the most battle-hardened. Those are the ones who've got the most fighting experience. So if you're looking at the probability that Russia could be successful with a limited incursion into a NATO state, you have to remember that they would move, say, 100,000 battle-hardened troops with all that expertise in drone warfare and take on, presumably, a smaller army on the other side of the border that wouldn't have that experience, probably any real combat experience that would be similar and useful in the war, nor the drone capacity. So it could see a big mismatch in the short run. Of course, their allies could intervene and save the day with that respect. In that respect, so that's what I say as we go into 2026. In my lifestyle live stream, I gave a prediction of a 50% probability in 2026 that we see the war stopping at least for a short amount of time. We could see a temporary ceasefire. In particular, Russia might try that if they wanted to attack the Baltic states, they could then redeploy their troops, knowing that the Ukrainians were in a lot of pressure not to attack them on the line of contact in Ukraine. And I think the chances of this war coming to an end will increase dramatically as we go through 2026 into 2027, because of the economic situation in Russia and the fact that it's going on already for more than 4 years, and almost up to 5 years at that point. And it will be hard for Russia to maintain the same deployment of resources that are diminishing without achieving its strategic aims. I always refer to Igor Girkin, who is in prison in Russia. He is a Russian ultranational war criminal, alleged war criminal, I guess, because he hasn't been prosecuted by a war crimes tribunal yet, but he has been convicted in absentia of organizing or being responsible for the shooting down of a Malaysian airliner over Donbass back in 2014. And he is one of the architects of Russia's invasions of Ukraine's, the initial ones in 2014 and 2015, in Crimea and the Donbass region, and he predicts that Russia has almost no chance of achieving its strategic goals at this point. He sees the war pretty much the same as me, even though we are clearly on very different sides, and he sees it as a toss-up between some sort of impasse that's protracted just because neither side can effectively win the war, and they basically stop fighting at some point, and the can is probably kicked down the road to another time when one side will have the upper hand dramatically over the other. You could look at, say, the wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan with Nagorno-Karabakh for an example of that, and then over 20 years later, Azerbaijan regaining control of its de jure territory. Or Ukraine will actually have a complete victory in the sense it will regain all the currently occupied territories. So from a Ukrainian point of view, Donald Trump has not been a great help to Ukraine, but he hasn't been a sort of catastrophic catalyst for its collapse. And they have now survived that change of regime, shall we say, in Washington. And they are producing a lot more of their armaments domestically. Plus, they have a lot more support from European countries. And we're going to have soon new supply routes from Romania, not just relying on Poland as the main conduit for their supplies from further west. And they just need to outlast Russia. War is very expensive in terms of treasure and people's lives, and it is not clear that an army fighting simply for imperial expansion will continue to have those huge losses indefinitely, whilst Ukrainians are fighting existential war for their political independence and national survival as a nation. So leave on that more optimistic point that 2026, 50-50, that we see some sort of cessation of hostilities at some point, and I would say that will dramatically increase. I gave a prediction 80% for 2027. So looking forward to a new year in spite of everything in the Russo-Ukrainian war. From a Ukrainian point of view, there is definitely merit to being an optimist. Slava Ukraini, Horom Slava, do перемоги.